My wife claimed I was too dull to be wanted and abandoned me for her former boyfriend who actually embraced risk. What Caroline didn't realize was that I'd been quietly preparing for this exact scenario for months, not because I predicted her departure, but because my work investigating corporate fraud had made me enemies who might target our personal life, requiring contingency plans that would soon prove invaluable for entirely different reasons. I'd built my career methodically over 8 years as a senior claims investigator at Desert Southwest Insurance in Phoenix, developing a reputation for solving complex fraud cases that cost companies millions and sent criminals to federal prison while earning enemies in organized crime circles who occasionally sent threatening messages to my office. My specialty was financial crime patterns that others missed, the kind of meticulous analysis that required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to remain emotionally detached while following evidence trails through months of painstaking investigation that often culminated in federal indictments and substantial prison sentences. Caroline Webb had been my anchor through all of it, or so I thought, sharing our quiet suburban home where I'd spread case files across the kitchen table each evening while she worked on marketing campaigns for local restaurants and small businesses from her converted spare bedroom office that overlooked our backyard. Our routine had become comfortable predictability, with me arriving home at exactly 6:15 each evening, discussing our days over dinner I'd prepared from carefully planned weekly menus designed to maximize nutrition and minimize grocery expenses, then settling into our respective work while she watched reality television shows that I found intellectually numbing but tolerated for the sake of domestic harmony. The morning everything changed started exactly like every other Tuesday for the past 3 years, with me reviewing a suspicious workers' compensation claim involving staged accidents and coordinated medical fraud while Caroline scrolled through her phone with increasing agitation, periodically sighing heavily and making pointed comments about how boring our life had become. She'd been restless for weeks, suddenly mentioning college friends she hadn't spoken to in years, expressing frustration with our quiet evenings spent reviewing case files and watching documentaries about financial crimes, and complaining that I never wanted to do anything spontaneous, exciting, or remotely adventurous beyond our monthly dinner at the same Italian restaurant we'd been visiting for 6 years. I should have recognized the sign sooner, but I'd been completely absorbed by a particularly complex embezzlement investigation involving a network of shell companies and cryptocurrency transactions that required all my analytical focus and had been keeping me at the office until nearly 8 every night for the past month. Caroline finally set down her phone and looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of cold determination and calculated cruelty that immediately triggered my investigative instincts and made me realize this conversation had been planned, rehearsed, and timed for maximum impact. She announced with barely contained excitement that Garrett Blackwood, her college boyfriend from Arizona State, had moved back to Phoenix after years of traveling the country and running his custom motorcycle business, and that reconnecting with him over the past month had made her realize how utterly suffocating, meaningless, and soul-crushing our marriage had become. According to Caroline, I was safe, predictable, and completely forgettable, the kind of man who analyzed every possible risk instead of taking any, who spent evenings buried in insurance fraud cases instead of seeking adventure, spontaneous experiences, and the kind of passionate intensity that made life worth living rather than merely existing. She explained with obvious excitement and barely concealed contempt that Garrett represented everything I wasn't, with his leather jacket lifestyle, willingness to embrace uncertainty and danger, and complete rejection of the boring middle-class existence that I'd somehow convinced her to accept for 8 miserable years of suburban mediocrity. The devastating irony wasn't lost on me that my ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, carefully honed through years of handling hostile claimants who threatened violence and uncovering elaborate fraud schemes worth millions of dollars, was exactly what she now found most repulsive about our entire relationship and marriage. I listened to her complete character assassination without interrupting, professionally noting the rehearsed quality of her delivery, the way she avoided direct eye contact during the most hurtful parts, and her obvious nervousness despite the calculated cruelty, all classic signs of deception and preparation that I'd learned to recognize through hundreds of fraudulent insurance claims and witness interviews. When Caroline finally finished explaining why she needed to leave with Garrett immediately to start the exciting life she'd always deserved, I simply nodded calmly and told her I understood completely, a response that clearly shocked her based on the confused and almost panicked expression that suddenly crossed her face as she realized I wasn't going to provide the dramatic scene she'd obviously expected. The unmistakable sound of a powerful motorcycle rumbling impatiently outside our front door punctuated the moment perfectly, and I realized that Garrett had been waiting in our driveway the entire time, probably coaching Caroline through this confrontation via text messages throughout the morning and providing moral support for her dramatic exit from our apparently insufferable marriage. I methodically helped Caroline pack her belongings into the custom leather saddlebags on Garrett's pristine black Harley, maintaining exactly the same professional composure and emotional detachment I used when dealing with particularly aggressive insurance claimants who thought they could intimidate me into approving obviously fraudulent claims worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. As Caroline climbed onto the motorcycle behind Garrett, who didn't even have the courtesy to turn off the engine or acknowledge my existence despite ending my 8-year marriage, she looked back at me with what might have been regret, confusion, or perhaps disappointment, clearly expecting tears, angry demands that she reconsider her decision, or desperate pleas for her to stay and work on our marriage like a proper abandoned husband should. Instead, I stood calmly in our driveway and wished them both completely genuine happiness in whatever adventure Caroline thought she needed, watching them speed away down our quiet suburban street toward her new exciting life, while mentally cataloging the unexpected relief I felt at finally having definitive confirmation of what my investigative instincts had been warning me about for months regarding the inevitable direction of our relationship. Over the next 10 days, I executed a disappearance plan that would have impressed the most sophisticated insurance fraudsters I'd spent years tracking, treating my life dissolution like the complex case file it had essentially become. The skills I'd developed investigating elaborate schemes involving false identities, hidden assets, and coordinated deception proved invaluable as I systematically erased Mitchell Webb from Phoenix while preparing to emerge somewhere else as someone completely different. I started by calling my supervisor at Desert Southwest Insurance and submitting my immediate resignation with 2 weeks of accrued vacation time, citing personal family emergency that required relocation, an explanation that raised no suspicion given my spotless 8-year record and the threatening messages I'd occasionally received from criminal organizations whose members I'd helped convict. The beauty of working in insurance fraud investigation was that my colleagues understood the necessity of occasionally disappearing for personal safety, and my supervisor actually seemed relieved that I was taking proactive measures rather than waiting for a threat to materialize into something more dangerous. Within 48 hours of Caroline's departure, I began systematically closing joint accounts and transferring assets through a carefully orchestrated series of financial transactions designed to leave no obvious trail for anyone who might later attempt to track my movements or locate my new identity. I liquidated our shared savings account, closed the joint credit cards after paying them off completely, and transferred my individual retirement accounts to a new investment firm in Albuquerque that specialized in serving clients with privacy concerns, including former law enforcement and corporate investigators who needed to maintain low profiles. The house presented a more complex challenge since both our names were on the mortgage, but I'd actually been preparing for this contingency for months through discreet consultations with a real estate attorney who specialized in rapid property transfers and asset protection for clients in sensitive professions. I contacted him immediately and within 72 hours had executed a quitclaim deed transferring my ownership interest to Caroline while simultaneously arranging for the property to be listed with a realtor who understood the urgency of the situation. Caroline would eventually discover that she now owned a house she couldn't afford to maintain on her marketing income, but that would become her problem to solve with whatever financial support Garrett's motorcycle business could provide. I spent the following weeks systematically selling furniture, electronics, and household items through anonymous online marketplaces, keeping only sentimental objects from my pre-Caroline life and essential items that could fit in my car for the drive to my new location. The methodical process of dismantling 8 years of shared domestic life felt strangely therapeutic, like conducting an archaeological excavation of a relationship that had been slowly dying for months before Caroline finally had the courage to kill it completely. I factory reset all electronic devices, established new email addresses through encrypted services, and arranged for mail forwarding through a series of private mailbox services that would route correspondence through multiple addresses before reaching my eventual destination. The same investigative techniques I'd used to track fraudsters who thought they could disappear into new identities now served me perfectly as I created my own legitimate version of exactly that kind of transformation. My destination had been chosen months earlier through connections I'd developed during my fraud investigation work, specifically a private investigation firm in Albuquerque that specialized in corporate security and occasionally needed experienced investigators for sensitive consulting projects that required discretion and expertise in financial crimes. The firm's owner, Marcus Rodriguez, was a former FBI agent who'd left federal service to start his own company and had been trying to recruit me for over a year, offering both flexibility and anonymity that traditional corporate employment couldn't match. I'd maintained contact with Marcus as a professional courtesy and potential backup plan, never imagining I'd need his services so soon or for such personal reasons rather than professional advancement. The consulting arrangement I negotiated with Marcus's firm provided legitimate income while allowing me to work remotely on complex cases that matched my specialized expertise, essentially continuing my fraud investigation career without the institutional constraints and public visibility that had made me a target for criminal retaliation in Phoenix. I arranged to rent a furnished apartment in Albuquerque's downtown area through a property management company that specialized in short-term corporate housing for traveling professionals, providing both anonymity and flexibility while I established my new life in a city where Mitchell Webb had no history, connections, or vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies from my previous cases. The digital erasure process required particular attention to detail, as I systematically deleted social media profiles, canceled subscription services, and modified privacy settings on accounts I couldn't eliminate entirely without triggering unwanted attention from automated fraud detection systems. I changed passwords on all remaining accounts to randomly generated strings that bore no resemblance to previous credentials, enabled two-factor authentication through new phone numbers purchased with prepaid services, and gradually reduced my digital footprint to nearly zero while maintaining just enough online presence to avoid appearing suspicious to financial institutions and background check services. The physical relocation required equally careful planning, as I needed to dispose of 8 years' worth of accumulated possessions without creating a paper trail that could reveal my destination or timeline. I sold my reliable Honda Civic to a used car dealer for cash, then purchased a different vehicle through a private party transaction in a neighboring city, ensuring that anyone attempting to track my movements would lose the trail at the Phoenix metropolitan area rather than following me to New Mexico. The new car was a practical Toyota Camry with excellent mechanical condition but unremarkable appearance, exactly the kind of vehicle that would blend into traffic and parking lots without attracting attention from law enforcement or anyone else who might be monitoring my activities. I established new banking relationships in Albuquerque before leaving Phoenix, opening accounts with a regional credit union that specialized in serving professionals who required privacy protection, including law enforcement officers, attorneys, and investigators whose work sometimes made them targets for retribution. The account opening process required careful documentation that established my legitimate employment with Marcus's investigation firm while maintaining operational security about my previous work and current location, a delicate balance that required exactly the kind of strategic thinking I'd developed through years of complex fraud cases. The entire dissolution process took exactly 10 days from Caroline's departure to my own exit from Phoenix, a timeline that reflected both my natural efficiency and the months of preparation I'd unknowingly completed while researching contingency plans for professional rather than personal reasons. I loaded my essential belongings into the Toyota Camry on a Thursday morning, took one final walk through the empty house where I'd spent 8 years building what I thought was a stable life with Caroline, then locked the door and drove away without looking back. The 4-hour drive to Albuquerque felt like traveling between completely different lives rather than simply changing cities, and by the time I reached my new apartment and began unpacking the carefully curated remnants of my previous existence, Mitchell Webb from Phoenix had effectively ceased to exist in any meaningful way. What Caroline had interpreted as boring predictability had actually been careful preparation for exactly this kind of rapid transformation, and her departure had simply triggered a contingency plan that I could execute with the same systematic precision I brought to complex fraud investigations involving millions of dollars and sophisticated criminal organizations. From my secure apartment in Albuquerque's downtown district, I maintained passive surveillance on Caroline and Garrett's rapidly deteriorating situation through encrypted communication channels and a trusted friend who unknowingly provided regular updates about the unfolding disaster they'd created for themselves. Beth Martinez had been Caroline's closest friend since college, a reliable source of information who had no idea she was feeding intelligence to a burner phone number I'd established specifically for monitoring the aftermath of my strategic disappearance from Phoenix. I'd contacted Beth under the pretense of wanting to ensure Caroline's well-being during our separation, presenting myself as a concerned estranged husband who simply wanted confirmation that she was safe and happy with her new life, a perfectly reasonable request that aroused no suspicion from someone who believed she was helping facilitate an amicable divorce. Beth's messages arrived with clockwork regularity every few days, initially filled with excitement about Caroline's dramatic new romance but gradually shifting to concern as disturbing patterns emerged in Garrett's behavior and lifestyle choices that didn't align with the legitimate motorcycle business he claimed to operate. According to Beth's reports, Garrett had immediately integrated Caroline into Phoenix's underground motorcycle racing scene, a subculture that operated in legal gray areas and attracted exactly the kind of questionable characters who made their living through activities that wouldn't survive careful scrutiny from law enforcement or financial investigators. The racing events took place in remote desert locations outside Phoenix city limits, involving substantial cash wagers and participants who preferred to remain anonymous for reasons that had nothing to do with simple automotive enthusiasm and everything to do with money laundering opportunities that sophisticated criminal organizations could exploit. Caroline had initially found the excitement intoxicating, posting carefully curated social media content that showcased the leather-clad lifestyle she thought she'd always wanted, but Beth noticed increasing signs of exhaustion and stress as Caroline struggled to adapt to a world where image mattered less than survival and where Garrett's mysterious business dealings required absolute discretion from everyone in his inner circle. The late-night gatherings at their shared apartment had become increasingly frequent and secretive, with groups of men arriving on motorcycles at irregular hours, conducting hushed conversations that ended abruptly whenever Caroline appeared, and leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that she couldn't understand but instinctively feared. Beth reported that Caroline had begun expressing confusion about Garrett's income sources, noting that his custom motorcycle business seemed to generate substantially more cash than could be explained by legitimate sales and service work, especially given the limited overhead of his one-man operation and the relatively small market for high-end motorcycle customization in the Phoenix area. Caroline's attempts to discuss their financial planning and future together were consistently deflected by Garrett with vague references to upcoming business opportunities and major projects that required careful timing and discretion, explanations that satisfied someone unfamiliar with criminal enterprise but would have immediately triggered alarm bells for anyone with experience investigating financial fraud. The personality changes Beth described were particularly revealing, as Caroline had begun adopting mannerisms and speech patterns that suggested she was trying to fit into a culture she didn't understand, using slang and references that sounded forced and artificial coming from someone with her middle-class marketing background and suburban upbringing. Meanwhile, my investigative network in Phoenix was providing much more detailed intelligence about Garrett's actual activities through channels that Caroline couldn't possibly access or comprehend, revealing a criminal enterprise that operated with sophistication and reach far beyond what she could imagine. The professional contacts I'd cultivated during 8 years of fraud investigation included several current and former law enforcement officers who monitored organized crime activities in the Phoenix metropolitan area, and their reports painted a disturbing picture of criminal enterprise that operated under the cover of legitimate motorcycle culture and automotive services. Garrett Blackwood had been using the underground racing scene as a sophisticated money laundering operation for at least 18 months before Caroline's arrival, accepting large cash payments from criminal organizations and cycling the funds through his motorcycle customization business to create the appearance of legitimate income from automotive services. The racing events themselves were elaborate criminal enterprises where illegal gambling, drug distribution, and financial transactions occurred simultaneously under the protection of remote locations and participants who understood the importance of maintaining operational security against law enforcement surveillance. Federal law enforcement had been building cases against multiple participants in the racing network for over a year, using surveillance techniques and financial analysis to document the flow of illicit funds through seemingly legitimate businesses that served as fronts for more serious criminal activities involving interstate commerce and organized crime. Garrett's motorcycle shop was one of several businesses under active investigation by a multi-agency task force that included FBI financial crime specialists, DA narcotics investigators, and IRS criminal investigation agents who were coordinating efforts to dismantle what they suspected was a significant organized crime operation with connections to criminal enterprises in multiple states. The evidence I obtained through my professional network indicated that federal indictments were likely within the next several months, timing that would coincide perfectly with Caroline's increasing exposure to criminal liability through her unwitting association with Garrett's illegal activities and presence at locations where federal crimes were being committed. Beth's reports revealed that Caroline had begun asking increasingly pointed questions about Garrett's business associates and their apparent wealth, observations that demonstrated her growing awareness that something wasn't right about the lifestyle she'd thought she wanted but was now trapped within. The expensive motorcycles, designer clothing, and luxury accessories displayed by Garrett's associates couldn't be sustained by legitimate employment in motorcycle customization, especially given the economic realities of operating small businesses in competitive markets with limited customer bases and high overhead costs. Caroline's marketing background had given her enough business knowledge to recognize when revenue claims didn't match observable market conditions, and her growing suspicion was creating tension in her relationship with Garrett that he couldn't resolve without revealing the criminal nature of his actual income sources. The surveillance information I collected painted a clear picture of Caroline's increasing isolation from her previous social circle as Garrett demanded more of her time and attention while simultaneously excluding her from any meaningful knowledge about his business operations or financial activities that might expose her to federal investigation. She was trapped in a relationship where her safety depended on maintaining ignorance about activities that could result in federal criminal charges, a position that someone with her intelligence and curiosity would find increasingly untenable as evidence accumulated around her. My decision not to intervene directly was based on both professional ethics and practical considerations, as any attempt to warn Caroline about Garrett's criminal activities would compromise ongoing federal investigations and potentially expose her to retaliation from criminal organizations that had significant resources and no compunction about eliminating perceived threats to their operations. The coordinated federal operation that dismantled Garrett's criminal network arrived with the precision and overwhelming force that characterizes major organized crime investigations, executed simultaneously across multiple locations to prevent evidence destruction and suspect flight. At exactly 6:30 on a crisp Tuesday morning in November, 37 federal agents from 3 different agencies descended on 14 separate locations throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, armed with search warrants, arrest warrants, and seizure orders that represented the culmination of 18 months of intensive investigation into money laundering and racketeering activities. Beth's frantic text messages began arriving at my burner phone within minutes of the raids, providing real-time updates about the chaos unfolding at Garrett's apartment where Caroline had become an unwilling witness to federal agents seizing electronics, financial records, and substantial amounts of cash that Garrett couldn't explain through legitimate business activities. Caroline had been sleeping when the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles surrounding their building awakened her to the sight of armed federal agents in tactical gear establishing perimeter security while others approached the apartment with a battering ram that proved unnecessary when Garrett answered the door in obvious panic. The FBI had coordinated the operation to occur during early morning hours when most targets would be home and unprepared for the sophisticated law enforcement response that had been planned down to the minute, ensuring maximum evidence recovery while minimizing opportunities for suspects to destroy documentation or flee to predetermined safe locations. Garrett's arrest occurred within the first 10 minutes of the operation, as agents executing the search warrant had found exactly what they expected based on months of financial surveillance and electronic monitoring that had documented his role in laundering proceeds from illegal gambling, drug distribution, and interstate theft operations that generated millions in criminal revenue. Caroline found herself in the surreal position of being questioned by federal investigators who were surprisingly gentle but thoroughly professional as they attempted to determine her level of involvement in criminal activities that she genuinely didn't understand, despite having lived with Garrett for months while the illegal operations continued around her. The lead investigator, Special Agent Patricia Hendricks from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, spent over 2 hours interviewing Caroline in a separate room while other agents systematically photographed and cataloged evidence that would form the foundation of federal prosecutions targeting multiple criminal organizations operating throughout the southwestern United States. Agent Hendricks later told her colleagues that Caroline's responses demonstrated genuine shock and ignorance about Garrett's criminal activities, an assessment that probably saved Caroline from criminal charges but couldn't protect her from the social and financial devastation that followed when news of the raids became public knowledge throughout Phoenix. Beth reported that Caroline spent the entire day in federal custody while investigators verified her identity, employment history, and financial records to confirm that she wasn't a participant in the money laundering scheme that had generated over $12 million in illegal revenue through Garrett's motorcycle business over the previous 24 months. The scope of the criminal enterprise shocked even experienced federal investigators, as evidence seized during the raids revealed connections to organized crime families in 3 states and money laundering operations that had processed criminal proceeds from activities ranging from human trafficking to corporate embezzlement that far exceeded anything local law enforcement had suspected. Garrett's motorcycle shop had served as the central hub for financial transactions that cleaned money for criminal organizations operating illegal gambling networks, drug distribution systems, and theft rings that targeted luxury automobiles for export to international criminal markets where American vehicles commanded premium prices. Federal investigators discovered that Garrett had been recruited by organized crime figures specifically because his legitimate motorcycle business provided perfect cover for large cash transactions that wouldn't attract attention from financial institutions required to report suspicious activity to federal authorities. The underground racing events that Caroline had found so exciting were elaborate criminal enterprises where illegal betting generated hundreds of thousands of dollars per event while providing opportunities for drug sales and criminal networking that connected various illegal operations throughout the southwestern United States. Caroline's attempts to contact me through our old communication channels failed completely since I had systematically eliminated all traces of my previous identity, leaving her isolated and desperate as she faced the reality that her exciting new lifestyle had been built entirely on criminal activity that could have resulted in federal prosecution. Beth's messages revealed that Caroline had been released from federal custody after investigators concluded she was an unwitting participant rather than a knowing conspirator, but her association with Garrett had made her unemployable in marketing positions that required background checks and security clearances that most employers now demanded. The apartment she'd shared with Garrett was sealed as a crime scene while federal investigators completed evidence collection, forcing Caroline to seek emergency housing with friends who were increasingly reluctant to associate with someone connected to major federal criminal charges that had attracted extensive media coverage throughout Phoenix and surrounding communities. The devastating personal cost of Caroline's adventure became apparent when she discovered that Garrett had been secretly recording their intimate conversations as potential blackmail material, a violation that federal investigators found on encrypted devices seized during the raids but couldn't prevent from becoming part of the public record during legal proceedings that would continue for years. Local news media coverage focused extensively on the arrests and seizures, featuring footage of expensive motorcycles being loaded onto federal transport vehicles while reporters provided background information about the criminal organizations that had been operating in plain sight throughout Phoenix's motorcycle community for over 2 years. Caroline's photograph appeared in several news reports as federal authorities attempted to locate additional witnesses and victims of the criminal enterprise, unwanted publicity that made her recognizable to potential employers who might have otherwise overlooked her connection to federal criminal investigations. The financial devastation extended beyond immediate unemployment, as Caroline discovered that Garrett had used her personal information to establish credit accounts and business relationships that created potential liability for activities she had never authorized or even known about during their brief relationship. The viral video that destroyed Caroline's reputation and remaining social connections emerged from a Phoenix motorcycle rally where Garrett had publicly humiliated both Caroline and me in front of hundreds of participants who recorded the spectacle for social media entertainment. The footage, captured by multiple cameras from different angles, showed Garrett standing beside his custom Harley with Caroline clinging to his arm while he delivered a rambling speech about liberating her from the boring existence she'd endured with her insurance investigator husband who was too much of a coward to embrace real adventure. Caroline appeared visibly intoxicated in the video, laughing inappropriately and adding her own cruel commentary about my predictable lifestyle, my obsession with analyzing risks instead of taking them, and my complete inability to understand what women actually wanted from relationships that mattered. The rally had taken place just 3 weeks before the federal raids, during what Caroline later realized was Garrett's desperate attempt to maintain his criminal network's loyalty while federal investigators were already closing in on evidence that would destroy his entire operation. Garrett's speech had been partly motivated by alcohol and partly by his need to project confidence during increasingly dangerous circumstances, but Caroline's enthusiastic participation demonstrated her complete commitment to the lifestyle that would soon cost her everything she'd built during 8 years of marriage to a man she now publicly mocked. The video gained viral status immediately after Garrett's arrest when someone recognized him in news coverage and connected his federal charges to the embarrassing footage that perfectly captured Caroline's transformation from respectable suburban wife to criminal accomplice who celebrated leaving behind everything stable and secure in her previous life. Social media algorithms amplified the video across multiple platforms as users shared it with commentary about karma, justice, and the consequences of abandoning good partners for exciting criminal enterprises that inevitably collapsed under federal investigation. Caroline's former colleagues at the marketing firm where she'd worked discovered the video within hours of its viral explosion, leading to immediate termination as company executives decided her association with federal criminal cases and public humiliation made her unemployable in client-facing positions that required professional credibility. Local Phoenix residents who recognized Caroline from news coverage began sharing the video with additional context about her husband's reputation as a respected insurance investigator who had helped convict numerous criminals during his career, creating a narrative about good men being abandoned for dangerous adventure that resonated with audiences across social media platforms. The contrast between Caroline's mocking laughter in the video and her desperate circumstances after Garrett's arrest created perfect dramatic irony that social media users found irresistible, generating thousands of comments about instant karma and the price of taking good relationships for granted. Beth reported that Caroline had become increasingly frantic as the video continued spreading, reaching friends, family members, and former colleagues who hadn't previously known about her relationship with Garrett or her connection to federal criminal investigations that were generating extensive media coverage throughout Arizona. Caroline's parents discovered the video through Facebook shares from relatives who were horrified by her public behavior and association with criminal activity that contradicted everything they taught her about making responsible life choices and maintaining personal dignity. The viral spread occurred with the merciless efficiency that characterizes social media destruction, reaching peak distribution within 72 hours as millions of users shared the footage across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok with commentary that ranged from sympathetic to brutal depending on viewers' personal experiences with relationship betrayal. Professional consequences extended far beyond her immediate termination, as Caroline discovered that potential employers throughout the Phoenix area had seen the video and associated her with both federal criminal investigations and the kind of poor judgment that made her unsuitable for marketing positions requiring client trust and professional representation. The video's impact on her social relationships was equally devastating, as friends who had initially supported her decision to leave me began distancing themselves from someone whose public behavior contradicted their own values about loyalty, responsibility, and appropriate professional conduct. Caroline's attempts to explain that she'd been intoxicated and manipulated by Garrett were undermined by the clear enthusiasm she displayed while mocking our marriage and celebrating her liberation from the boring stability that represented everything she now desperately needed to rebuild her destroyed life. The timing of the video's viral explosion, occurring just days after Garrett's arrest, created a perfect storm of public humiliation that made Caroline's situation significantly worse as she simultaneously faced unemployment, housing insecurity, potential criminal liability, and social ostracism that extended throughout her personal and professional networks. My investigative contacts confirmed that the video's distribution had been subtly amplified by law enforcement agencies who found it useful for demonstrating the human cost of criminal enterprise and the way organized crime operations destroyed innocent lives through manipulation and exploitation. The footage served as an effective public service announcement about the consequences of abandoning stable relationships for criminal adventure, though I had not requested or coordinated this amplification through my professional network connections. Caroline's humiliation was compounded by the discovery that multiple versions of the video existed, with some featuring extended footage of her dancing inappropriately with known criminal associates while explicitly mocking the mundane security of her previous marriage to a man whose investigative work had actually protected countless innocent victims from the same criminal enterprises that she was now celebrating. Social media forensics revealed that the video had been shared by law enforcement accounts, victim advocacy groups, and criminal justice organizations as an example of how sophisticated criminal networks manipulated vulnerable individuals into participating in their own destruction while abandoning the stable relationships that could have protected them from exploitation. The viral phenomenon created a lasting digital record that would follow Caroline indefinitely, as screenshots and clips were preserved across multiple platforms by users who found her story representative of broader cultural themes about loyalty, responsibility, and the consequences of choosing excitement over stability in personal relationships. Garrett's desperate attempt to minimize his criminal liability by shifting blame to Caroline demonstrated the calculated manipulation that had characterized their entire relationship, as his public defender pursued a defense strategy designed to portray her as the corrupting influence who had driven him toward increasingly reckless criminal behavior. The legal strategy emerged during preliminary hearings when Garrett's attorney, Thomas Williamson, presented a narrative claiming that Caroline's expensive tastes and demands for luxury lifestyle had pressured Garrett into accepting money laundering contracts with organized crime figures to fund their relationship. According to court documents I obtained through my investigative network, Williamson argued that Garrett had maintained a legitimate motorcycle business for years before meeting Caroline, whose materialistic demands and threats to leave him for wealthier men had corrupted his previously clean criminal record. The defense strategy painted Caroline as a manipulative gold digger who had systematically destroyed Garrett's moral compass through emotional manipulation and financial pressure that forced him into criminal enterprise against his better judgment and established character. Federal prosecutors immediately recognized this blame-shifting tactic as a common defense strategy in organized crime cases, where defendants attempt to minimize their sentences by claiming they were coerced or manipulated into criminal activity by romantic partners, family members, or business associates. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Martinez, who was leading the prosecution team, had significant experience with defendants who attempted to use romantic relationships as justification for criminal behavior, and she prepared to counter Garrett's claims with evidence demonstrating his criminal activities predated his relationship with Caroline by several years. My professional contacts within federal law enforcement provided detailed intelligence about the defense strategy, including information that Garrett's legal team was actively seeking character witnesses who could testify about Caroline's alleged manipulative behavior and expensive lifestyle demands that supposedly drove him toward criminal enterprise. The irony of Garrett's defense strategy was particularly striking given that Caroline had been genuinely ignorant about his criminal activities throughout their relationship, making her an unlikely criminal mastermind capable of orchestrating the sophisticated money laundering operation that federal investigators had documented through 18 months of surveillance. I learned through encrypted communications with a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office that prosecutors were preparing to introduce financial evidence proving Garrett's criminal activities had generated millions in illegal revenue beginning 2 years before he reconnected with Caroline, completely undermining his claim that she had corrupted his previously legitimate business operations. The federal investigation had documented multiple money laundering transactions through Garrett's motorcycle business that occurred during periods when he had no contact with Caroline, proving that his criminal enterprise was well established before their relationship began and operated independently of any influence she might have exerted. My decision to provide anonymous assistance to federal prosecutors was motivated by professional ethics rather than personal vindictiveness, as I recognized that false testimony in federal criminal cases could compromise other ongoing investigations and allow dangerous criminals to escape appropriate punishment for their crimes. Through carefully encrypted communications, I provided federal investigators with detailed financial analysis demonstrating patterns in Garrett's criminal activity that predated his relationship with Caroline, effectively destroying his defense strategy before it could be fully implemented in court proceedings. The evidence I compiled using techniques learned through 8 years of insurance fraud investigation showed conclusively that Garrett's money laundering operation had been sophisticated and profitable long before Caroline became involved in his personal life, making his claims about her corrupting influence demonstrably false. Federal prosecutors incorporated my analysis into their case preparation, using the financial evidence to file additional charges against Garrett that carried mandatory minimum sentences and eliminated most opportunities for plea bargaining that might have reduced his prison term. The enhanced charges effectively ended Garrett's attempt to blame Caroline for his criminal behavior, as federal sentencing guidelines now required substantial prison time regardless of any mitigating circumstances his defense team might present to the court. Within days of the additional charges being filed, other co-defendants in the money laundering network began cooperating with federal investigators, providing testimony that further documented Garrett's central role in criminal activities that had operated for years without Caroline's knowledge or participation. Caroline appeared at my parents' home in Phoenix after exhausting every other option for contact, sitting on their familiar front porch for hours before they finally called the emergency number I had left them in case of genuine crisis situations that required my immediate attention. My parents had been carefully briefed about my relocation and the necessity of maintaining operational security, but they retained one secure communication method that Caroline apparently remembered from conversations during happier times in our marriage when she had shown interest in my work. The call came through encrypted channels at 11:30 on a Saturday night, my father's voice conveying both concern and confusion as he explained that Caroline had been sitting outside their house since afternoon, refusing to leave until she could speak with me directly about urgent matters that she claimed affected both our futures. I agreed to one final meeting but insisted it occur at a neutral location away from Phoenix, settling on a remote rest stop along Interstate 40 approximately halfway between Albuquerque and Phoenix, where we could meet without compromising my new identity or providing information that might lead to future contact attempts. The drive to the meeting location took 2 hours through desert landscape that reminded me of the life I had deliberately left behind, and I found myself reflecting on the strange circumstances that had led to this final accounting between two people who had once planned to spend their lives together. Caroline was already waiting when I arrived, sitting alone at a picnic table under harsh fluorescent lights that made her appear older and more fragile than I remembered, her usual confidence replaced by exhaustion that suggested months of stress and uncertainty since our last encounter in our kitchen. She looked up when she heard my footsteps approaching, and I saw recognition followed by relief cross her face as she realized I had actually come to this remote location to hear whatever she needed to say about our destroyed relationship. I sat down across from her at the weathered picnic table, maintaining the same professional composure I had shown during our kitchen confrontation months earlier, waiting for her to begin the conversation she had requested through such desperate measures. Caroline started with a genuine apology for the cruelty she had displayed during our breakup, acknowledging that her public mockery of our marriage had been wrong regardless of her feelings about our relationship at the time, and expressing regret for words that she now realized had caused unnecessary pain. She admitted that her pursuit of excitement with Garrett had been motivated by fears about settling into premature middle age with someone whose stability she had mistaken for weakness, and that she now understood the difference between security and boredom in romantic relationships. Caroline explained that the federal investigation had taught her to appreciate the value of integrity and consistency in personal relationships, qualities that she had taken for granted during our marriage but now recognized as rare and precious in a world full of people who prioritized immediate gratification over long-term commitment. The conversation continued for over an hour as Caroline detailed her financial struggles, unemployment, and social isolation that had followed Garrett's arrest and the viral video that had destroyed her reputation throughout Phoenix's professional community. She asked if I might consider reconciliation or at least friendship, suggesting that we had both learned from our mistakes and might be able to build something better from the ruins of our previous relationship. I listened to her complete presentation without interruption, noting the same analytical skills that had made her successful in marketing now being applied to reconstructing our personal history in ways that minimized her agency and responsibility for the choices that had led to our current situation. When she finished speaking, I confirmed that our marriage was permanently ended and that I wished her well in rebuilding her life, but that my decision to move forward separately was final and not subject to negotiation or reconsideration. I explained that my disappearance from Phoenix had been motivated by professional safety concerns rather than romantic vindictiveness, and that her departure had simply accelerated security measures I had been planning for months due to threats from criminal organizations whose members I had helped convict. The final revelation surprised Caroline completely, as she realized that my boring predictability had actually masked sophisticated contingency planning for exactly the kind of rapid identity transformation that most people could never execute successfully. I told her that my work investigating fraud had taught me to identify patterns of deception and manipulation, and that her relationship with Garrett had displayed classic warning signs that I recognized from hundreds of criminal cases involving financial exploitation and emotional manipulation. She asked if I had known about Garrett's criminal activities from the beginning, and I explained that I had suspected something was wrong but had chosen not to intervene directly because any warning might have compromised ongoing federal investigations that were more important than our personal drama. Caroline sat quietly for several minutes after I finished explaining the professional considerations that had guided my decisions throughout our separation, apparently processing the reality that her exciting adventure had been orchestrated by someone who viewed her as a useful tool rather than a romantic partner. She asked why I had helped federal prosecutors strengthen their case against Garrett instead of simply allowing events to unfold naturally, and I explained that my professional obligation to ensure accurate legal proceedings outweighed any personal satisfaction I might have gained from watching him escape appropriate punishment. Caroline seemed shocked to learn that I had maintained professional ethics throughout her betrayal, apparently expecting that I would have allowed personal vindictiveness to influence my decisions about criminal justice matters that affected other victims beyond our immediate situation. I clarified that my assistance to federal prosecutors had been motivated by concern for the integrity of the legal system rather than revenge, as false testimony in criminal cases could undermine other ongoing investigations involving victims who deserved justice. The conversation concluded when I stood up from the picnic table and wished Caroline genuine success in whatever new life she chose to build from the wreckage of her previous decisions, explaining that I harbored no ill will but could not offer the friendship or reconciliation she had requested. I told her that I had found peace in my new circumstances and hoped she would eventually find the same stability and contentment, though our paths would never intersect again regardless of her future choices. Caroline remained seated at the picnic table as I walked back to my car, and I could see in my rearview mirror that she continued sitting there long after my taillights disappeared into the desert darkness. The drive back to Albuquerque felt lighter somehow, as if completing this final conversation had closed a chapter that had been weighing on my consciousness despite my successful transition to a new life and identity. I realized that Caroline's request for reconciliation had been the last loose end from my previous existence, and that refusing her had completed the transformation I had begun the day she left with Garrett. The woman who had once criticized my cautious approach to life had discovered too late that her pursuit of excitement had led directly to the criminal underworld, while my boring predictability had enabled a sophisticated escape that protected me from the consequences of her choices.